on to the next thing. We've talked about the conflict, but let's look at the cause. And I think part of the healing comes from gaining a deeper understanding of why we are the way we are. And I think that's key. So we're going to spend some time talking about this. I think when we begin to talk about why we are the way we are, that's what begins to take this whole deal from the idea of just emotional issues and behavior modifications to finding spiritual answers for our emotional problems. There's a reason we are the way we are. We're going to talk about a couple of them. There are things that have happened. We just didn't become who we are overnight. There are things that have occurred that have brought us to this point, and that's the part that we're going to begin to talk about here. So maybe when we talked about this idea of comparing ourselves to others, maybe we have begun to realize, if we haven't, it didn't take me very long. By the age of 25, I realized I was different than most cats. You know, that I was prone to self-destructive behaviors, that my serenity was tied to my fleshly actions. All those different things were there that made me see how complicated I was compared to other people. And then I began to see myself as not having the struggles that they do and the uniqueness of who I am. We are unique. Each of us are different. Each of our struggles are different. The things that we go through are different. The things that make us who we are makes us unique. And these issues make us, as we stated in the cause, complicated. Now, I'm going to focus on one cause because I'm not a psychiatrist. And I don't know what meds someone needs to take. But I want to talk about it for a minute. There are two reasons for emotional issues. One of them is a psychosomatic, metaphysical, whatever term you want to put with it, that deals with a chemical imbalance in your mind. If you're schizophrenic, take your medication. If you're bipolar and been diagnosed as it, we're going to talk about these, take your medication. Because there are problems that we have that manifest themselves emotionally that are more psychiatric than emotional. Make sure you're doing that. Make sure you're doing that. But I want to tell you, as we move on to the next part, that there's a couple drawbacks to the meds. One of them I want to talk to you about first is I don't know if medications are the complete answer. They may be. You may have a psychotic issue that causes you to have to take medication for the rest of your life. I'm not denying that. But there's one thing that I do know about medications is that medications can bring us up to an even playing field where we can work on stuff. Medications are not designed to just make us numb. Alcohol did a pretty good job of that for me. Okay? Because as we look at our life, there's some emotions, even bad ones, that we need to feel. Sadness, grief, sorrow, fear. All these emotions within range are emotions that are God-given us. And what medication does is it stops those things in our mind from experiencing them. Like I said, some people these emotions are way out of range and they need to take medication. But the thing about the medication is they can bring us up to an even playing field where we can begin to do what we're going to talk about after lunch, which is work on our thought life. That's the first one. If you have been diagnosed, I want to make it real clear, with any type of serious mental health, psychiatric issues, regardless of what I say today, continue to take your medications. I think the church has really went off range with that. Okay? And I don't like it. I don't like people saying that don't need medications, no one needs to take medications. That's like someone who's really thin and never struggled with their weight telling me, just don't be fat. All right? Well, that's real cool. So I want to get that out of the way. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. Because I'm definitely not equipped to talk about it. You need to get a psychiatric exam. You need to talk to your psychiatrist. The second part of it is that emotional problems come from emotional scarring. Okay? They come from that. Emotions that come as a result, and the emotional disorders are usually emotional scars. Things like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, where trauma has occurred in our life. Not much was ever said about this till guys started coming back from Vietnam and their struggles. And at that point in time, the psychiatric community began to look at it, where things have happened in people's lives that do that. Being in war is really traumatic, no question about it. But we also suffer this, as I'm going to show you, from things from our childhood or even in our life, emotional scars. And when these emotional scars get irritated, that irritation drives us to respond to them with survival mechanisms that we talked about in the last session. Man, I knew how to fix my emotional problems. It was involved in suburban. Why? Survival mechanism. Got to find serenity. New relationship. Okay? Got to work harder. Got to have more stuff. All those things to respond to emotional disorders. When these survival mechanisms kick in, they begin to produce all these behaviors. One thing that may be referred to and often said, because a lot of my experience is working with people who have struggled with addiction, myself included, is the word that's used is called triggers, or things that cause us to go back to other behaviors. But the key to remember is that a return to a behavior that gives us temporary serenity. Now, we can't live without serenity. We're going to get it one way. I think people sometimes feel serenity because they got chaos in their life. Do you know any people like that? They're just drive on it. Drama. Whatever it is that takes to give us serenity, we're going to take it. We're going to go that route. For the abuser, let's use that as an example. Their serenity is based on control. They're going to control the person that they're abusing to the point that they feel serenity from them. The person that's being abused needs the abuser, believe it or not, because they need to be controlled. And that's where they find their serenity. It's kind of a sick way to do this. But I want to tell you that right now, that type of relationship is 2 in 10 in America. 2 in 10 relationships revolve around people like that are not emotionally healthy. But it's all tied to serenity. Okay? But that's where we're at today. And that's where the emotions come in. And that brings us to screen 3, which is the cause and 3 things that we're going to cover this morning. Okay? Now, you don't have to tell me that there's not other things. I'm well aware of it. But this is a one-day conference, so I want to cover the 3 that I know the most about, right? So these are the 3. I'm not saying that you fit into one of these 3 categories. You may not, but I just want to cover them. These are the 3 that I have been mostly experienced with and the ones that I see the most. These causes for this come from these disorders: codependency, control, and performance-based acceptance. We're going to talk about these 3 and how they manifest themselves. The first one is codependency. The fruit of this is failed relationships, one after the other. You know? Men and women both can struggle with codependency. I have seen it more with women, maybe just because they're more honest. I don't know. But I've also seen men who have struggled with codependency. And what it means is you are emotionally dependent to someone else. Whether it's through approval or their affection or whatever. The fruit of this comes and it shows itself usually in relationships. But it can also expand. It's always in relationships, not always in romantic, but it can be in friendships. You know, I have had people that were codependent that struggled with me because I couldn't do what they wanted to do for them so that they would have serenity. They couldn't do it. Oh, Pastor Mike, I just respect you so much. Okay? I still got a job to do. And I can't be focused always on what's going on with you. So it always manifests itself in relationships and how we deal with them. I've seen this between parents and children, where parents have been not good parents, however you want to phrase that, or children have not been good kids, and the need to have them, that connection, drives them to some ridiculous behaviors, which normally involves money when it's kids and parents. The one that we always think about is the romantic relationships, where we just go from one relationship to another. I had a lady one time that I was counseling that came to me and she said, I really feel good. I was like, really? Well, that's cool. I'm initially thinking that maybe my counseling is working. Boy, was I wrong. She said, I met a guy. I said, really? I said, you don't love yourself enough to love someone else. You don't understand yourself enough to be in a relationship. I will tell, was one of the things that I do is work with men in recovery, and I would always tell them that some of the worst news I could hear is when a guy comes to our recovery meeting or meets with me and says, Pastor Mike, I just met the neatest woman at an NA or AA meeting. That's not. There's no neat women there. There's no neat guys there. Every one of them are struggling. And what you think is joy and emotional safety and security is really just codependency. The second one is control. Well, let's talk just a moment about codependency and where it comes from. All right. The bottom line is it's a issue of self-esteem or healthy self-awareness. I like the phrase self-awareness because in the 90s, the phrase self-esteem got to be popular, and I understand it, and I know what they're trying to say. I just prefer the idea of a healthy self-awareness, not that I need to think awesome of myself, but that I have a solid view of myself, okay? A realistic, honest view. But where it comes from is usually some sort of rejection. Rejection as a child, rejection in a relationship. You weren't accepted for who you were. And therefore, you couldn't accept yourself for who you are. Okay? Now, a lot of these things I'm going to talk about deal with absentee parents, whatever, and I want to help you to see that. Not a criticism. I'm not here to do family counseling or anything like that. I just want to show you where the disorder may come from. So, that's where it comes from. Abusive parents, unloving parents, parents that rejected you, parents that didn't meet your emotional needs, which is kind of relative. Yeah, we need parents to tell us that we're great and swell, but we also need parents to point out where we need help. That's why absentee parents is a lot of times where codependency comes from. Second thing is control. Control is a big issue. Back in the 80s and 90s, it was okay to say, well, I'm just a control freak. I want to tell you today, it's an emotional disorder. If you feel like everything has to be under your control, man, you're going to struggle. If all your serenity is tied to that, you're going to struggle. And oftentimes, it's raised in a situation where life is out of control. Mine was like that. My dad was an alcoholic, abusive. My mom was a codependent, and it was a nightmare. Okay? So, oftentimes, it has to do with that. And because our lives are so out of control, when we get to a point in time where we begin to be aware of who we are and develop a personality, we try to get that control back. It also can be by parents that were overbearing and even abusive, where we don't know how to run our life. Parents, I'm interested in seeing what it does down the years, but in recent history, there is this idea of helicopter parents that are like hovering over their children. Exact opposite of the way I was raised. I was raised with no restriction. When we played with guns, we played with real guns. So it was insane. But today, to overcome that, many parents are overbearing. I see them on the playground. Maybe you've seen these moms. And if you're one, I'm not criticizing you. I just think it's interesting. Where they follow their kids around with this hand sanitizer. They get off the swing and they go, shh, shh, make sure you wash your hands. When I ate dirt, not only my hands get dirty, but I put it in my body. So, overbearing parents. The next thing is parents that are overbearing in the way that they control their children. They dictate what they're going to do, where they came from. They dictate how things are going to go out. Either way, they breed in us a person who needs control for serenity. By the way, I want to go on the record as saying this, and this is being streamed. These are the worst people to pastor. They are terrible. They make terrible sheep. All right? But a lot of people struggle with it. Now, I want to tell you, it's not okay to be a control freak. It's not. It's an emotional disorder that many people struggle with. All right, let's get to the third thing. We talked about codependency, control, where it came from. The next thing is performance-based acceptance. This is a big one. And sometimes the church kind of breeds this because we're all about holiness and perfection and doing things right. And my whole problem is because I'm not in God's will and all those different things. And God's going to zap me if I don't get my act together. Sometimes it breeds this idea of performance-based acceptance. Where does it come from? The first thing it comes from is from a false theology. Okay? God bless my friends in the holiness movement. I spent some time in that. But sometimes this idea of holiness and perfection breeds this idea of being under the law or in the flesh. Remember, Galatians 5. Walking in the Spirit doesn't mean obeying the law of the flesh. And remember, legalism is a form of finding serenity in my fleshly desires through my works-based. Okay? So be careful of that. Because the first thing with the holiness movement that I found when I started working with people is there's a whole bunch of people that don't fit into it. People like me, they're crazy. I mean, they're doing stuff they don't know why they're doing it. They're addicted to stuff. They have all these thoughts and emotions that don't fit into that neat little holiness box. And that's one of the first things that this comes from. Okay? And usually the person that struggles with performance-based acceptance, and it's come from this, lives in guilt. Okay? Live in guilt. They just never good enough. They don't see God for who He is. They don't see God as a God of grace. They don't see that. They see themselves as constantly guilty and never measuring up as it relates to God. We're going to talk about that a little bit more this afternoon after lunch. The second place that this comes from is from parents, obviously. You know who the number one child, the child in a family setting that struggles with this the most is usually number two child. Because if number one was a great kid, number two might not measure up. Number one might be great at athletics. Number two might be good at video games. Okay? Number one might be an academic whiz. And it's bred by parents who are constantly comparing them. I'll give you an example in my family, my family dynamics. My son is 10 years older than my daughter. And my son is getting ready to graduate from law school this year. So he'd actually be a lawyer. I mean, can you believe that? An alcoholic with a lawyer kid? There were days where I needed a lawyer. So it's cool. So that's pretty amazing, isn't it? But my daughter is just a junior in high school. So I have to be careful of, man, look what Tyler's doing. You can do the same thing. You could be a doctor. You could be an astronaut. What if she doesn't want that? What if she doesn't want to be compared to my son? Okay? Well, I hope she doesn't. But what we do is we develop in the family dynamic something that was there. Maybe even in your family dynamic, you had a sister or a brother that turned out to be okay, but you had your struggles. Okay? They did everything right. You did everything wrong, or at least seemed that way. Okay? So that's the second thing that it produces. The third thing in the family dynamics is when abuse, not measuring up. I think in my era, in my day, we spanked way too much. Maybe today they don't spank enough. I don't know how that works. But there was something that was wrong there. I think in my family dynamic was that my dad, who was an alcoholic, everything kind of revolved around him and who he was. We didn't know what we were going to get when he came home. I came home from football practice one day, and he was asleep in the yard. I tried to get him up. He didn't get up. I went in there and told my mom. She goes, I don't know. He does that quite often. So he slept out in the yard all night. He was a big man, too, by the way. So I wasn't just going to pick him up and carry him in. But everything revolved around him. We struggled financially because of his alcoholism. That was a big one. We didn't have things that other people had because my dad was a drunk and he drank everything up. Now, I'm not casting stones because I was going down the same path myself. But I'm just showing you how it began to breed in us performance-based acceptance. So everything revolved around him. So because everything revolved around him, we didn't have a chance to develop our own healthy self-awareness. And then also, because of the circumstances we lived in, we felt less than. Meaning that we weren't like other kids. We felt like we didn't measure up. And at the end of the day, that was really key. Because in not measuring up, we had to do it some way. Performance. I want to talk to you about how some of this stuff leads to. For me, I wanted to be accepted by other people. I didn't feel accepted by myself, but I wanted to be accepted by other people, which led me smoking weed, doing acid, drinking. Okay? You get it? And that's usually where performance-based acceptance comes from. It is a belief that my serenity is tied to how I perform. Okay? Sometimes there's measuring sticks. How much money I have, how much I've done, how much I've performed, how well I've done. It's usually performance-based acceptance is based on a measuring stick of where we're at. And obviously, when we don't measure up, it breeds depression, anxiety, and even fear about what am I going to do. So we have to be careful of that, because that's how that part works. All right? I'm going to cut off probably about 10 minutes, well, maybe 5 minutes to noon. And I'm going to pray, and then I'm going to give you a chance, anyone that's here, to ask any questions. I'm going to do the same thing at the end of the first session, okay? So I'll give you a chance to answer any questions about this, because this is key. All right? That's the three things. That's the three disorders that we get ourselves caught up in. For boys, usually, no matter which one of these we struggle with, we usually struggle with this idea of a rite of passage. Now, I'm not saying that my dad, who was at home most of the time, and an alcoholic, was as good as an absentee dad, or better than an absentee dad. I don't know. But I know one thing: we are raising a whole generation of men who don't get a rite of passage. You know? That don't have that. Maybe you didn't have it. Maybe that's the case. Same thing with women. Irregardless, because we don't get these things, we don't understand what it feels like to pass from childhood to adulthood, man or a woman. Okay? So we don't get that rite of passage. For me, a rite of passage from my old man was being able to handle a six-pack of beer and find a woman. That's no rite of passage. That's sickness. So some of us never got to that point. For girls, oftentimes, because absentee father, codependent mother, whatever, have children at an early age, engaged in sex before they're ready. Okay? Now, I'm not saying here that the two-parent home is the only way to go. But what I am telling you is, regardless of what your family situation is, you better be instilling these things into your kids, because a lot of us didn't get it, and it led to these issues. A single mom can do it, a single dad can do it. I'm just kind of helping you see why we get into the situation that we're in today. All right? The other thing it leads to is not only sex at an early age, but it begins to lead with experimenting with drugs and alcohol. That's what it did for me at an early age. Why? Because we're just not measuring up. Our personalities are not measuring up. We're not getting, our self-awareness is not where it needs to be. All those different things don't measure up, but because we want serenity in our life, we begin to seek them. Every alcoholic and drug addict I have counseled, except with the exception of one group, conveys the same story to me. The other group is, and this is something that we've seen popular today, is overprescription of opiates because of pain, and then they get opiate addiction. That part there is something that is relatively new, but it happens. But outside of that, every drug addict, every alcoholic that I have ever talked to and counseled, as we have done their step forward, has had the same kind of thing. Something wrong in the family, which produce codependency, control, or performance-based acceptance. All right. Another one that we often see is like eating disorders. The lady in the video struggled with bulimia, and she was constantly making herself throw up because her mom told her she was fat. Okay? Some people struggle with eating because eating is like an addiction that they find comfort in. I counseled a woman once who was an alcoholic, and I was helping her with her addiction, kind of helping sponsor her. She was a good friend of mine. And the lady told me, I asked her one day, I said, how are you doing with your alcohol? And she goes, well, I haven't drank. She said, but I went to Food Lion and got a gallon of ice cream and ate it all. Food. Finding comfort in it, serenity in it. Sometimes we do that. Just about all eating disorders, and I've done the research, come from some sort of emotional scarring. But here's the one thing before we move on that I want you to know. When the wound gets irritated, emotions demand response, regardless of what it is that we struggle with. Now, I'm going to talk to you more about our thought life after lunch, which will help you see where you kind of fit into that. They produce a thought, even sometimes subconsciously, that can produce destructive actions that seem to provide serenity. Okay? That's the way this thing works. And what we're going to talk about after lunch is dealing with this on the thought level. So let me give you just a few things before we move on. Some of these I've already talked about. Some of the things that they produced, and maybe you can identify with these in your own life. Sex at an early age, which is a misguided way to feel love. Seeking the approval of others. People-pleasing is the phrase often used. Damaged relationships when total acceptance is not felt. Oh, that's tough, isn't it? When total acceptance is not felt. You know? I had a guy not too long ago, because they don't come here anymore, so I can't tell, so I guess I can use this as an example. No names. I had a guy that came here not too long ago. And, we would have several people here on Sunday mornings, and he would come, I would shake his hand, I would listen to him, and then I would move on to the next person because I couldn't, I had other people waiting to talk to me. And the guy says, I don't like it because every single time you meet with me, you walk off. You see how it damaged that relationship between he and I? Because he didn't feel total acceptance to me. Total acceptance. Can we have relationships with people that we don't need them to totally accept us? I hope so. Okay? Because I don't have time to totally accept everyone. Okay? And to meet their emotional needs, do we? We don't either. So, total acceptance isn't felt, so when that occurs, relationships get damaged. Next one is experimenting with drugs and alcohol, which leads to addiction. Often because we don't feel connected and we're trying to find connection in something else, in community, that will also make us feel better. It always leads to addiction. The last thing is a lack of identity and a failed sense of who we are. Those are usually the things that are produced as a result of this. All right, what does it do? It makes us complicated people. Others tell us to get their act together, but we can't. We continue in this passing on of issues to the next generation and living lives of misery rather than abundant life. What we have talked about today are just signs of things that have occurred. Oftentimes, those things in our life, things happen to us that we didn't sign up for. But we bear the consequences of them today. It's important for us to acknowledge it. They are passed on to us. I believe my alcoholism and my struggle with alcohol was clearly a hereditary move. I didn't blame my dad because of my drinking. but it was something there hereditarily. And I'm sorry, the numbers are too much to bear it out. That alcohol, drug addiction, codependency, if you struggle in relationships, good idea that your kids are going to struggle in relationships. These are things we don't sign up for. They're passed on to us, and they come from our past. Just about all these disorders that I've talked about, including my own alcoholism, have a hereditary nature to them. Now, before we move on, and this afternoon we're going to talk more about this idea of transformation and our role in it. But here's the deal. We have spent the entire morning talking about our issues. We need to become sick and tired of being sick and tired. I mean, maybe today something has occurred in you a little bit more than just, yeah, I can identify with that. Okay? All right? We're not here to create the blind, sick, and lame club. We're here to have victory. Maybe today, because you've gotten sick and tired of being sick and tired, that you want to stop accepting a marginal life. After lunch, we will look at the process of healing. But every bit of healing begins with a realization, I need to change. And some of us today need to have another prodigal son moment. So I want to tell you a story of the parable that Jesus taught. Real simple. Probably the most popular parable that Jesus ever told. It's called the parable of the prodigal son. Anyone ever hear of this thing? Let's talk about this for a moment. The story begins with a man who has two sons. In Luke 15. What we're going to cover is going to be Luke 11 through 15, 11 through 22. Luke chapter 15, it's written up there. I'm just going to tell you about it, okay? I'm just going to tell you about it. There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to the father, let me have my share of the estate. And his father gave it to him. And he left there and went to a distant country. The first thing is that I don't know what made the son make this stupid decision. You know, the end of the text really doesn't tell us because, in my view, if it did, Jesus would have told that in the story. I don't think it really matters because he still did it. And he took his money and he went off to a distant country. I want to tell you this morning, every time my heart goes off to a distant country, I am the prodigal son. I am the prodigal son. I couldn't tell you the number of prodigal son moments I've had. And it's okay to have another one. For you performance-based acceptance people like me, that may be a little bit tough to accept. I don't want to burst your bubble, but you can still do it if you need to. After a while, he squandered all his wealth, and he hired himself out to a citizen of the country who hired him, who sent him out to the fields to feed the pigs. Now, the key here is, what we often heard is, he ended up in a place that no Jewish boy needed to be, and that was feeding pigs. All right, I get that. And there's a lot of ways that we could relate that to our life. But the bottom line is, he ended up in the hog pen. That was plan A. Because he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. Plan A didn't work. How's your plan A working out? How's your plan D working out? Okay? Plan A did not work. So, verse 17 says, he came to his senses. And he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to eat and a roof over their head, but here I am starving to death? I'll return to my father, and I'll say to him, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your servants. Okay? That's what happened in his mind. The thing that I want you to see is, for us to change, when we accept these things about our life, we're accepting the hug pin. I like how the guy just wants out. He doesn't want to make the hug. He's tired of making the hug pin livable. We want to make the hug pin livable, right? This hug pin wouldn't be too bad if I had a big screen. How about a recliner? Universal remote. Today we could maybe add Netflix. I don't know. But there's a problem with it. It's still the hug pin. It's the hug pin of codependency, control, addiction, performance-based acceptance, no matter what it is. At that moment in time, when the guy says, I want out of this, things begin to change. He goes back to his father and he tells him, who was actually looking for him. And when he saw him a way off, he ran out and kissed him. Right? It was amazing. It's like he was almost sitting on the porch waiting for this guy to return. You don't think God's waiting on you to return? He is. He's waiting on this guy to return, and when he sees him from a distance, he runs out, kisses him, hugs him. The son tells him, listen, I've sinned against you, and I've sinned against heaven. I'm no longer worthy to be your son. Make me like one of your servants. What does the father do? Man, he just throws a party. He brings the ring and the robe. The robe signifies the father's righteousness, meaning he's good enough. The ring signifies the sonship. Everything changed that moment in time when he got sick and tired of being sick and tired. And that's what I want to close with. But what I want to do is something a little bit different. I'm going to give you a chance. What I would like to do, and then when we're done, I'm going to pray. What I'd like to do, if you got a question, is to come up here and I'll answer them for you. We're going to eat lunch probably a little bit before 12. Make sure you let them know, David, if you don't mind. Thank you. And I don't know. It may be a little after, depending. I just want to give you a chance to answer some questions for you. Make sure you come up here to ask me them, okay? And I'll answer any questions that you have. Keep in mind, after we're done, I'm going to give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have. We're going to eat, and we should be able to pull this off, as small as the crowd is, from 12 to 12:30. Now I want you to come back in here. We're going to have some more worship music, and then what's going to happen is we're going to do the afternoon's teaching. Okay? And we should have everything wrapped up by 2. But here's what I want you to do. I want every head bowed, every eye closed. It doesn't count if you're sleeping. All right? Every head bowed, every eye closed. And I want you to think for a moment. Maybe today you want your life to change, or you know someone else whose life needs to change. Regardless of what it is, regardless of where you're going through, I want to tell you something. If you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, I want you to silently convey that to God. And what I want you to do is, in telling him this, I want you to ask him to kind of open up your heart and mind to what he wants to say to you this afternoon. Maybe you even need to say, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. I've blown it. I'm tired. I just want out of this emotional tension that I'm going through. And then I'm gonna close in prayer. So just quietly say pray that. And then I'm going to close in prayer, and then I'm going to give you a chance to. Destructive behaviors. And all these things we ask in Christ's name. Amen. All right. I'll tell you what. We're going to I'm going to give you a chance if you want to come up to answer any questions that you have. One thing I forgot to do is to pray for the meal, but I'm going to pray for you. Let me give you a couple instructions. Go out here, make a right. For those of you who went to get coffee, that's also where the meal is. The meal is in the fellowship hall. And I think what they have is Mexican, and they're going to kind of divvy it out for you as you go through the line. And we'll be back at 12:30, okay? So that'll give you plenty enough time to eat and relax. If you need to wash your hands or whatever, I'm like Bob Newhart. I wash my hands repeatedly. And you just catch the part where he told her, oh, that's okay. Why? Because he was a germaphobe. And he was constantly scared of germs. So go out and then go to the fellowship hall, use the bathrooms if you need to. So let's pray. Father, we ask for your blessing upon this meal. We pray, Lord, for the blessing for this meal, that it would strengthen us and encourage us. And we also lift up our time this afternoon. And all these things we ask in Christ's name. Amen.